Picture this. It's 80 AD, and you're standing in the brand new Colosseum, watching as Emperor Titus himself gives the signal that will unleash 100 days of the most savage, blood-soaked entertainment the world has ever seen. We're talking about massive naval battles flooding the arena floor, exotic animals tearing prisoners apart limb by limb, and theatrical executions so twisted. What started as Titus's grand opening celebration would spiral into centuries of increasingly depraved spectacles that pushed the very boundaries of human cruelty, all in the name of entertainment. The year 80 AD marked a turning point in human history that most people completely misunderstand. When Emperor Titus officially opened the Flavian Amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum, he wasn't just unveiling a new building. He was introducing a systematic approach to mass entertainment that would redefine what it meant to be entertained for the next 4 centuries. And trust me, the opening ceremony alone was so extreme that it would make modern extreme sports look like children's playground games. The inaugural games lasted for 100 consecutive days, and every single day brought new horrors that the Roman population couldn't get enough of. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Titus wasn't content with just regular gladiatorial combat. No, he wanted to make a statement that would echo through the ages, so he ordered the arena to be flooded with water from a complex system of aqueducts and drains, transforming the fighting ground into a massive artificial lake. What happened next was called a naumachia, and it was essentially a full-scale naval battle fought to the death right there in the heart of Rome. Imagine thousands of condemned criminals and prisoners of war being forced onto actual warships, armed with real weapons, and ordered to fight until only one side
remained standing. These weren't actors putting on a show. These were real battles with real casualties, and the water quickly turned red with blood as ships rammed into each other and men drowned in their armor. The crowd went absolutely wild for it, cheering as human beings slaughtered each other in what was basically a giant death pool. And this was just day 1 of a 100-day festival of brutality. But Titus was just getting started. Between the naval battles, he introduced something called venationes, which were essentially elaborate animal hunts that took place right there on the arena floor. Now, when I say animal hunts, I don't mean a few lions chasing some deer. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of exotic animals imported from every corner of the Roman Empire. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinoceros, crocodiles, and creatures that most Romans had never even heard of before. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Historical records suggest that during those opening games alone, over 9,000 animals were killed in increasingly creative and horrifying ways. Here's where it gets even more twisted. The Romans didn't just want to see animals fighting each other or being hunted by professional beast fighters called bestiarii. They wanted to see condemned criminals being torn apart by wild animals in the most dramatic way possible. So they developed elaborate stage productions where prisoners would be dressed up as characters from mythology or literature, and then fed to the beasts while acting out famous death scenes. Picture someone being forced to play Orpheus, the legendary musician, only instead of charming the animals with his lyre, he's being mauled to death by a bear, while the crowd applauds the performance. The level of theatrical cruelty was beyond anything we can imagine today. Prisoners might be dressed as Icarus, strapped to mechanical wings, lifted high above the arena, and then dropped to their death on the sand below. Others were forced to play Hercules, but instead of defeating the Nemean lion, they were torn apart by multiple lions while wearing the hero's costume. The Romans had turned execution into entertainment, and the more creative and brutal the death, the more the audience loved it. Emperor Titus set the bar impossibly high with his opening games, but what came after him was even worse. When his brother Domitian took power, he looked at what Titus had accomplished and said, "Hold my wine, I can do better." Domitian was obsessed with proving that he was a greater emperor than his brother, and his method of proving this was to make the arena spectacles even more elaborate, even more brutal, and even more shocking. Domitian introduced nighttime games, illuminated by thousands of torches, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the violence seem even more surreal and terrifying. He also expanded the types of gladiators, creating new categories of fighters with different weapons and fighting styles.
But his most disturbing innovation was the introduction of female gladiators and dwarf fighters, turning what was already a horrific spectacle into something that seemed designed to mock and dehumanize every possible type of person. The female gladiators, called gladiatresses, weren't just women who chose to fight. Many of them were slaves or condemned criminals who were forced into the arena against their will. They fought against each other, against dwarfs, and sometimes against wild animals, all while the crowd jeered and placed bets on how they would die. The Romans found something particularly entertaining about watching women kill each other, and Domitian made sure to provide plenty of these matches to satisfy the bloodthirsty appetite of his subjects. But even Domitian's reign of terror in the arena was nothing compared to what came later. When emperors like Caligula and Nero took power, they transformed the Colosseum into their personal playground for the most depraved fantasies imaginable. Caligula, who was widely considered insane even by Roman standards, would sometimes force members of the audience to fight in the arena if he didn't think the regular gladiators were entertaining enough. Picture sitting in the stands, enjoying what you thought was going to be a normal day of watching people die for your entertainment, only to have the emperor's guards drag you down onto the sand to fight for your life because Caligula was bored. Nero took things in a different direction, but somehow made them even worse. He was obsessed with theatrical performances, so he turned executions into elaborate stage productions that could last for hours. Condemned prisoners would be forced to act out entire plays before being killed, often in ways that corresponded to their characters' deaths in the original stories. But Nero's twisted genius was in making the line between performance and reality completely disappear. The audience never knew if what they were watching was acting or genuine terror, and that uncertainty made everything more thrilling and horrible at the same time. One of Nero's most notorious innovations was the use of elaborate mechanical devices to make executions more spectacular. He had engineers design contraptions that could lift people high into the air, spin them around, and then drop them or crush them in ways that created maximum visual impact. These weren't quick, merciful deaths. They were drawn-out spectacles designed to maximize both the victim's suffering and the audience's entertainment. The crowd would cheer, not just for the death itself, but for the creativity and technical skill involved in making it as dramatic as possible. As the decades passed, each new emperor felt pressure to outdo his predecessors, and this led to an arms race of brutality that pushed the limits of human imagination. By the 2nd century AD, the games had evolved into something that would be unrecognizable to modern audiences. Entire forests were recreated on the arena floor, complete with trees, streams, and wild animals, just so that elaborate hunts could take place in a natural setting. Hundreds of condemned criminals would be released into these artificial wilderness areas and hunted down like animals by professional killers armed with bows, spears, and hunting dogs. The scale of these productions was absolutely mind-boggling. Historical records indicate that some games featured over 10,000 participants and lasted for weeks at a time. The logistics alone were staggering. Imagine coordinating the capture, transport, and care of thousands of wild animals from across the known world, managing the construction of elaborate sets and mechanical devices, and organizing the imprisonment and execution of thousands of human beings, all for the sake of a few days of entertainment. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these spectacles wasn't their scale or their brutality. It was how normal they became to ordinary Roman citizens. What started as special occasions marking important events gradually became routine entertainment. People would pack lunches and make a day of watching human beings and animals slaughter each other. Children grew up thinking this was perfectly normal. Vendors sold snacks and souvenirs. People placed bets on which gladiator would die first, or which animal would kill the most prisoners. The Roman historian Seneca, writing in the 1st century AD, described attending the games during a lunch break and being horrified by what he saw. He wrote about watching unarmed men being driven into the arena to face armed gladiators, with no chance of survival and no possibility of mercy. But what shocked him wasn't just the brutality. It was how casually the audience treated these murders. People were eating, talking, laughing, and placing bets while human beings were being butchered just yards away from them. The economic impact of these games was enormous and created a whole industry built around human suffering. Professional animal hunters traveled to the far corners of the empire to capture exotic beasts. Slave traders specialized in providing fresh victims for the arena. Weapons manufacturers created increasingly elaborate and deadly tools for gladiators. Architects and engineers designed new ways to make executions more spectacular. An entire economy grew up around the systematic killing of human beings for entertainment, and it employed thousands of people who saw nothing wrong with making a living from organized murder. The training schools for gladiators were perhaps the most disturbing part of this whole system. These were essentially academies of death, where human beings were taught how to kill and be killed in the most entertaining way possible. Gladiators learned not just fighting techniques, but also how to die with dignity and style, because a good death was just as important as a good kill in terms of crowd entertainment. They practiced bleeding dramatically, falling gracefully, and even how to beg for mercy in a way that would move the audience to either spare them or finish them off quickly. The gladiators themselves were a mix of slaves, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and surprisingly, some volunteers who chose this life for the fame and potential wealth it could bring. The successful gladiators became celebrities with their own fan clubs, endorsement deals, and groupies. But even the most successful gladiator lived with the constant knowledge that each fight could be their last, and that their death would be cheered by the same people who had previously celebrated their victories. What makes this all even more chilling is how the Romans justified it to themselves. They didn't see these spectacles as senseless violence. They viewed them as important civic events that served multiple purposes. The games were supposed to demonstrate Roman power and superiority over their enemies. They were meant to show that Rome could command the resources of the entire known world, bringing together animals and people from every corner of the empire for their entertainment. They were also seen as a way of giving the population a controlled outlet for their violent impulses, preventing them from turning against the government. The emperors used the games as a form of political control, understanding that a population entertained by massive spectacles was less likely to revolt. The phrase, bread and circuses, comes from this period, referring to the Roman strategy of keeping the people fed and entertained so they wouldn't question the government's actions. As long as there were regular games with increasingly spectacular violence, the people would remain loyal to whoever was providing the entertainment. But the system was ultimately unsustainable, both economically and morally. The cost of capturing, transporting, and maintaining thousands of animals was enormous. The expense of building and maintaining the infrastructure needed for these massive spectacles was bankrupting the empire, and gradually, even the Roman population began to grow tired of the constant escalation of violence. What had once seemed shocking and thrilling became routine and boring, forcing the organizers to come up with ever more extreme spectacles just to maintain the audience's interest. The rise of Christianity also began to undermine the moral foundation of the games. Early Christians were often fed to wild animals in the arena, but their willingness to die for their beliefs and their refusal to fight back or beg for mercy began to make the spectacle seem less entertaining and more troubling to some observers. The sight of people going to their deaths with dignity and even joy, praying for their killers rather than cursing them, created a stark contrast with the savage brutality surrounding them. By the 4th century AD, the games were becoming less frequent and less elaborate. Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, began to restrict the most brutal aspects of the spectacles, though he didn't eliminate them entirely. The economic strain of maintaining the empire, combined with changing moral attitudes and the logistical challenges of organizing such massive events, gradually led to the decline of the arena culture. The last recorded gladiatorial games took place in 435 AD, more than 3 centuries after Titus opened the Colosseum with his 100 days of slaughter. By that time, the Roman Empire itself was crumbling, and the resources that had once been devoted to staging elaborate mass murders were needed for defending against barbarian invasions and maintaining basic governmental functions. Looking back on this period from our modern perspective, it's almost impossible to understand how an entire civilization could have embraced such systematic cruelty as entertainment. The scale and duration of these spectacles represent one of the most disturbing chapters in human history, a time when the deliberate infliction of suffering became not just acceptable, but celebrated as the highest form of public entertainment. The legacy of the Roman arena spectacles extends far beyond ancient history. They represent a dark reminder of what human beings are capable of when violence becomes normalized and systematized. The cheering crowds, the elaborate productions, the economic systems built around human suffering, all of these elements came to get her to create a form of entertainment that was essentially organized genocide dressed up as public spectacle. What's perhaps most disturbing is how quickly and completely ordinary people adapted to this level of brutality. Within a generation, what would have seemed unthinkably horrible to earlier Romans had become normal, expected, and even boring unless it was made more extreme. This shows how rapidly moral boundaries can shift when violence is presented as entertainment and justified as serving a greater social purpose. The Roman arena spectacles weren't just historical curiosities or examples of ancient barbarism. They were a systematic exploration of the human capacity for cruelty, carried out on a massive scale over centuries, with the full support of the government and the enthusiastic participation of the population. They show us what happens when a society decides that human life has no value beyond its entertainment potential, and they serve as a warning about how quickly civilization can transform into something monstrous while still maintaining the appearance of order and culture. The blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum absorbed the lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings and millions of animals, all sacrificed to satisfy the Roman appetite for increasingly extreme spectacles. What started as Titus's 100-day celebration became a centuries-long festival of death that consumed entire populations and whole species of animals, leaving behind only ruins and the historical record of humanity's capacity for organized cruelty on an industrial scale.